In this video, we'll look at 3 surprising admissions from the opponents of Jesus, which actually validate his claims to be a miracle worker. Then we'll look at 1 objection from Joe Rogan and see how we can answer it. As a Christian, I find a lot of hope in the Bible. It tells me there's a God who cares about me, who heals people, who provides a way to have relationship with him forever. Now, a lot of people looking at Christianity from the outside ask this question. Can we really trust anything that the Bible says when it has so many miracles? Why should we trust anything it says when it sounds more like a mythical, fantastical story than a historical account? I understand this hesitation. Even as a Christian, I don't want to be gullible or be duped by fake miracles and fake stories. I have a naturally critical mind, and I'm often ready to break down the logical flaws of claims that are presented to me. On top of that, I don't want to be gullible, blindly just believing something that I want to be true. But even in light of that, when we look at the miracles of Jesus, there are some really good historical reasons to believe that they actually happened. There are 3 ways that the enemies of Jesus contribute to the historical case that Jesus was a miracle worker. First, the enemies of Jesus didn't deny that he was a miracle worker. Historians, even secular historians, are nearly unanimous on this fact. The enemies of Jesus viewed him as a miracle worker. What the Pharisees tried to do is they tried to catch him on technicalities, like performing miracles on the Sabbath. In John 9:16, it says, "Some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.' But others said, 'How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?' And there was division among them." When their appeals to Sabbath guidelines failed, the Pharisees attributed his power to a more nefarious source. They said he casts out demons by the prince of demons. But as Jesus pointed out, this was a nonsensical objection because Satan wouldn't want to cast out his own allies. And either way, it shows that the Pharisees couldn't deny that Jesus was doing miracles. This is incredible. Not only were Jesus' followers convinced that he was doing miracles, but even the enemies of Jesus had to tacitly admit that he was doing things that they couldn't explain. The second way the enemies of Jesus surprisingly help us is in the area of Jesus' greatest miracle, the resurrection. You see, they admitted that the tomb was empty. Christianity began in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified and buried. Most historians agree that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, just as it was recorded in the Gospels. So the site of Jesus' tomb was well known. If the body was still in the tomb, then the authorities would have had all the evidence that they needed in order to disprove the idea of the resurrection. His body would have been right there. Instead, the enemies of Jesus admitted that the tomb was empty. They did this when they claimed that the disciples stole the body. As the author of The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel, points out, this is just a weak cover story to explain why the tomb was empty. The early church fathers, Justin Martyr and Tertullian, report that this was the cover story used by the Jewish authorities for subsequent centuries. By telling this story, the enemies of Jesus were admitting that the tomb was empty, which is powerful evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Third and finally, the enemies of Jesus saw him alive. One of the most powerful reasons to believe in the resurrection is that the followers of Jesus were willing to die for the fact that they had seen him alive. Again, the majority of historians, even secular historians, will agree to the fact that the disciples were convinced that they had seen him alive. What many people don't realize is that this includes 2 former opponents of Jesus as well. And these enemies of Jesus became followers because of these resurrection appearances. The first opponent is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, James was not a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, and the gospel reports, embarrassingly so, that he didn't follow him during his ministry. In fact, he wasn't even present at his own brother's crucifixion. But seeing his brother alive from the dead convinced him that he was indeed a miracle worker, and in fact, the Messiah himself. The second opponent is the Apostle Paul, who was originally a persecutor of the early church and a violent opponent of Jesus. But when the risen Jesus appeared to him, he couldn't help but call him Lord. Because of the miracle of the resurrection, these opponents became followers of Jesus. They were both leaders in the early church and were eventually martyred for their faith. Their belief in the resurrection gives us confidence to know that the Bible is right when it talks about the miracles of Jesus. Now, just to examine one popular objection to this idea, I hear a lot of people say that people were just really gullible back then. For example, in a recent interview, Joe Rogan said this.
Talking about historical scholars from 2,000 years ago. Right. And their knowledge of science and biology and life and the universe itself was extremely limited.
Right.
And so their entire fundamentals, like everything they believed in, was based on mythology. And there's a lot of people that are not that bright.
Yeah.
They're not smart, and they're easily led, and they're easily manipulated. But it also doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't real.
I get where Joe is coming from on this, but I ultimately don't think this is a fair criticism. First, people back then weren't gullible just because they had a supernatural worldview. They didn't see the miracles of Jesus and go, well, just another Tuesday. No! They were shocked, amazed, astounded, perplexed, flabbergasted, positively flummoxed. They recognized that this was something completely different than anything they had ever experienced before. For example, the man who was healed in John 9 responded to the undue skepticism of the Pharisees when he said, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." It was the amazing quality of Jesus' miracles that convinced people that he was really from God. Second, why should we assume a modern skeptical attitude towards miracles? As we've seen in other videos, there's an incredible amount of evidence that points to the reality of modern-day miracles. Those that reject these well-documented cases have yet to give a reason why we should automatically discount all these experiences. Of course, we should ask what the evidence is for any particular miracle, but I find that a lot of people set the standard so impossibly high that they're ultimately just not being open-minded anymore. So when we read the Bible and we see the miracles of Jesus, we can know with confidence that what we're reading is true. Jesus really made the blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear, and the dead rise. The enemies of Jesus had to admit that he was a miracle worker, and we should too. In John 14:11, Jesus explicitly appeals to his miracles as a reason that we should believe in him. The author of John also says that he recorded these signs that we may know that Jesus is the Son of God, and that by believing in his name, we may have life. The miracles of Jesus show us that he had credentials unlike any other. They give us good reason to know that he was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, come to offer us salvation. Will we choose to believe? But what about when miracles don't happen? That's what we're talking about in the next video, so if you don't want to miss that, hit subscribe and we'll see you then.